Every empire convinces itself that its treasure will last forever, that the vaults will never run dry, and the coins will always command respect. History proves something much harsher. Even a mountain of precious metal can disappear almost overnight. In 1917, while the Russian Empire was breaking apart under the weight of global war, internal revolution, and betrayal from within its own elite, one of the greatest state gold hoards on Earth effectively vanished. Measured in modern terms, we are talking about wealth worth billions. It did not simply fade from a budget line. It slipped into the chaos of a dying empire. Some insist that this treasure bankrolled the Bolsheviks and allowed them to survive. Others claim it was quietly taken by foreign powers. Still others argue that it was scattered across Siberia, hidden, stolen, and never fully recovered. What can be said with certainty is this: once that gold disappeared, the financial backbone of an empire that had once stretched across half the planet was gone. The loss of that reserve was not just an accounting issue. It ripped out the economic spine that had held the state together, and it helped finish Imperial Russia as a functioning power. The consequences did not end in the 1920s. They echo forward into the present day, every time global politics turns to currencies, reserves, and the question of who really controls wealth. At the opening of the 20th century, the Russian Empire was not only gigantic in land and population, it was also sitting on one of the largest piles of monetary gold in existence. By 1914, on the eve of World War I, Imperial Russia held more than 1,200 metric tons of gold in reserve. Only France possessed more. That meant the Tsar's treasury outweighed Germany's holdings, outweighed Britain's, and even surpassed the gold reserves of the United States when measured in raw bullion. At that time, gold was not just a symbol. It was the bloodstream of the global financial system because national currencies were anchored to it. The Russian ruble drew its credibility from this immense hoard. On international markets, the ruble could be treated as trustworthy because behind every note lay real metal in imperial vaults. For the government, this meant the ability to borrow abroad, raise and equip armies, and pay for imports. For ordinary Russians, it represented, at least on paper, a promise of stability. The message was simple and powerful. The empire can pay its bills, the ruble is sound, and the future is secure. War shattered that confidence. War destroys money as quickly as it destroys men. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Russia mobilized millions of soldiers and forced its entire economy into feeding the front. The financial cost was staggering. Within barely 2 years, total military expenditure had tripled. Ammunition, rifles, heavy guns, uniforms, coal, locomotives, and entire stretches of new railway built just to move shells and troops. Every part of that machine demanded payment in hard currency, and a great deal of it had to be purchased from abroad. Gold began flowing out of Russia westward as the empire struggled to pay allies and creditors. At the same time, the government started printing paper rubles far beyond what the remaining gold stockpile could realistically support, gambling that no one would immediately force a reckoning. The result was inflation that accelerated out of control. A ruble once treated with respect on global markets started looking weak even inside Russia. Prices for basic food doubled, then tripled, while wages lagged far behind. For workers in the cities and peasants in the countryside, everyday life turned brutal and unsustainable. By 1917, the imperial structure was visibly breaking apart. Soldiers at the front refused orders. Mutinies erupted in units that had once marched without question. Massive strikes shut down factories in the major cities. Crowds filled the streets demanding bread, and riots over food supplies exploded in industrial centers. The February Revolution forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate, ending more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule in a matter of days. A provisional government stumbled into place, but it was weak, divided, and already mistrusted. It tried to keep Russia in the war and hold the state together, yet it faced collapsing morale, a starving population, and a military on the edge of open revolt. Inside that crisis, one urgent question rose to the surface. What should be done with the empire's gold reserves? Parts of that treasure were physically moved east, farther from the front lines and away from the unrest and street violence in Petrograd, the city now known as St. Petersburg. Entire trains loaded with bars and coins rolled into the vastness of Siberia. Those trains were guarded by troops whose loyalty, by this stage of the crisis, could no longer be assumed. Some portions of the bullion were transferred abroad to places such as London, Paris, and even Japan, used as collateral to secure loans and supplies. But not every shipment was recorded, and not every railcar arrived where it was supposed to. In the confusion of revolution and counter-revolution, large quantities of gold simply vanished. The emergency transfers eastward, the frantic movements across borders, and the secret deals created a fog that has never fully cleared. By the time the dust settled, no one could say with certainty how much had been moved, how much had been pledged, and how much had already slipped into a black hole that would never be mapped again. When the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917 and pushed the provisional government aside, they did not inherit the full mountain of bullion that had once made Russia second only to France in total reserves. They received only part of it, and that missing share is where the story moves from dramatic to opaque. The Bolshevik leadership immediately began deploying whatever gold they still controlled to keep their new regime alive. Lenin and Trotsky understood a hard reality. Speeches and ideology do not buy rifles or bread. They sold gold abroad to fund the Red Army. They exchanged it for supplies under the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in 1918. They also used it to purchase leverage with foreign governments and to extract a degree of recognition. Western intelligence reports from that era, however, repeatedly hinted that the hoard the Bolsheviks commanded was dramatically smaller than the imperial stockpile from only a few years earlier. Somewhere in the transition, hundreds of tons had already slipped out of reach. One likely destination for part of that missing wealth was the camp fighting against the Bolsheviks. During the Russian Civil War, the anti-Bolshevik forces, often called the White Armies, held large territories, controlled rail lines, and seized depots. In Siberia, Admiral Alexander Kolchak emerged as one of their main leaders. He gained control over a massive quantity of the eastbound gold that had been shipped out of the imperial core during 1917. At one point, Kolchak is believed to have had access to more than 500 metric tons stored in the city of Kazan. But when the Bolsheviks finally captured him in 1920, that enormous reserve had largely vanished. Some of the gold had reportedly been stolen outright by corrupt officials or foreign mercenaries. Some had been shipped abroad as payment for weapons and supplies. Some was simply looted along the way. Even now, stories circulate about Kolchak's trains carrying crates of imperial bullion deep into Siberia and then disappearing. Other portions of the treasure may have ended up in foreign hands through more direct intervention. Britain, France, and Japan all deployed troops on Russian territory during the Civil War. At the time, rumors spread that these powers intercepted or secured shipments of Russian bullion, framing it as repayment for loans and military aid that Russia supposedly owed them. The United States faced similar accusations, that American forces quietly took possession of Russian gold, while insisting it was only being safeguarded. Solid, documented proof for most of these claims is still thin. But what can be stated clearly is this. By the early 1920s, the colossal gold mountain that had belonged to the Russian Empire had been cut down to a shadow of what it once was. The reserve that had anchored the ruble and projected imperial strength was no longer intact. For regular people inside Russia, the disappearance of that gold reserve was not some distant drama playing out in secret rail cars. It hit everyday life. Without a solid reserve of precious metal backing the ruble, the currency collapsed. By 1921, inflation had become so extreme that basic goods cost absurd amounts of paper money. Buying something as ordinary as a loaf of bread could require thick bundles of rubles numbering in the thousands. Money that had once served as a reliable promise of value turned almost worthless, almost overnight. People turned away from official currency because it no longer worked. Barter came back. Families traded food, clothing, tools, or labor directly just to survive. The empire had lost not only its monarchy and huge sections of territory, it had lost the basic foundation of financial trust that had once held the economy together. Here is the part that shows this was not only a Russian disaster. The collapse followed a pattern visible across very different eras. Ancient Rome cheapened its currency by diluting the silver content of its coins. Germany after World War I printed marks in such volume that the money was shredded. In Russia's case, enormous stores of physical gold did not just fall in value. They were physically moved, intercepted, or stolen, ending up in trains, in private vaults, and in individual pockets. The details change from case to case, but the outcome is painfully consistent. Ordinary people are left destitute, stripped of savings and purchasing power. Those with access to power, connections, or force usually manage to protect themselves or even profit from the turmoil. In every version of the story, when money is debased and trust is destroyed, society itself begins to unravel. As the Russian Civil War dragged on, the legend of the vanished imperial gold grew larger than any official record. It became more than an accounting dispute. It became folklore. Foreign agents, aristocrats driven into exile, and peasants living in remote villages all passed along stories about entire trains loaded with bullion that disappeared into the Siberian winter. One enduring tale described a convoy halted near Lake Baikal. In that telling, crates of gold bars were thrown into the frozen water, so they would not fall into Bolshevik hands. Another story claimed that Kolchak's generals smuggled shipments across the coast to Japanese ports in exchange for weapons. Whether these accounts are accurate, exaggerated, or invented is still debated. What matters is what they reflect. Total chaos, in which one of the world's largest state reserves turned into a prize fought over by every faction, domestic and foreign. For the Bolshevik government, whatever remained of the imperial hoard was more than simple treasure. It was oxygen. Lenin understood a brutal rule of survival. Money keeps revolutions alive. Ideology could attract followers and justify harsh measures, but it could not feed cities or keep locomotives running in winter. Between 1918 and 1921, the new Soviet state exported tons of bullion. They moved it through intermediaries in places such as Sweden, Germany, and even the United States, converting the gold into food, coal, fuel, weapons, and diplomatic leverage. In a twist of irony, some of the very gold that had once backed the old Tsarist ruble was melted down, recast, and pushed into Western markets. The financial bedrock of the fallen empire was literally transformed into liquid funding for a regime that promised to erase that empire. But while the Bolsheviks used the gold still in their hands to avoid immediate collapse, others used the same moment to enrich themselves. Western banks, middlemen, and government-linked buyers were quick to purchase Russian bullion at steep discounts, even when its legal origin was questionable or openly disputed. For those outsiders, the logic was simple. Russia was desperate, and desperate sellers accept brutal terms. This dynamic was not unique to Russia. It appears every time an old system fails. When one order falls apart, opportunists gather. Wealth and influence quietly change hands, often without any public record, while people on the ground are left to endure hunger, shortages, and chaos. By the middle of the 1920s, the Soviet state had clawed back control over what little remained of the former imperial reserves. But the scale of that remainder was tiny compared to what had existed before the First World War. Out of the more than 1,200 metric tons of gold that had backed the empire in 1914, estimates indicate that fewer than 300 metric tons were still under Bolshevik authority. Everything else had been stolen, traded away for weapons and supplies, quietly looted by insiders, or simply vanished into places where it could no longer be traced. The population that had once been told the ruble was as good as gold was left instead with a shattered economy, a paper currency that had become almost useless, and decades of hardship under a new government. And that new government had already absorbed a lesson that nearly every state eventually learns. Whoever controls the money controls the population. This leads directly to the present. Why should a vanished pile of imperial Russian gold from 1917 still matter in the world of 2025? Because the underlying logic has not disappeared. Modern governments accumulate reserves for a reason. Those reserves help support their currencies and project strength to rivals and allies. Central banks quietly move bullion between high-security vaults in financial centers like New York, London, and Zurich. They talk publicly about transparency while keeping the most sensitive numbers behind closed doors. Countries under pressure, whether it is Russia under sanctions, Venezuela under collapse, or China quietly increasing its holdings, understand that gold remains the one asset that still carries weight when confidence in paper money slips. In moments of stress, real metal is still treated as the ultimate backstop. The echoes of 1917 are also clear in the way reserves are now used as punishment. Over the past decade, Western powers have frozen massive amounts of Russian foreign reserves as a direct response to Moscow's geopolitical actions. In modern form, that is the same basic move as seizing Kolchak's trains or blocking Bolshevik shipments a century ago. The message is unchanged. Money is not just an economic instrument, it is a political weapon. It can be captured, locked away, or denied. And once again, the people who suffer most are not the leaders making the decisions. Inflation, shortages, and instability fall hardest on ordinary citizens, not on the elites who still have access to protection, networks, and options. There is another lesson buried in the fate of Russia's lost gold. Wealth that exists only because people collectively agree to trust. It can disappear much faster than most people expect. The Russian Empire believed that its gigantic bullion reserve made it secure, almost untouchable. War and revolution exposed how weak that belief really was. Today, many assume their savings are safe because those savings sit inside bank accounts or retirement funds. But if those balances are denominated in fiat currency, then they are ultimately backed by something intangible: trust in governments, trust in central banks, and trust in financial systems that have already failed before. History shows that once that trust begins to crack, the value people thought they possessed can evaporate with shocking speed. So, what should we take from the disappearance of Russia's imperial gold in 1917? The first point is direct. Never confuse paper promises with tangible wealth. People in the Russian Empire believed the ruble was secure because there was a mountain of bullion sitting in state vaults. Once those vaults were emptied, the ruble stopped being a store of value. It became scrap. The second point is that moments of crisis are the exact moments when wealth quietly changes hands. The empire fell apart, but bankers, smugglers, foreign governments, and connected insiders made fortunes in the turmoil. The same pattern will repeat in the next major crisis, whether that crisis takes the form of a financial crash, a currency meltdown, or a geopolitical shock. The last point is that whoever controls money controls people. The Bolsheviks learned that quickly, and modern governments and central banks understand it just as clearly. The disappearance of the Romanov-era reserve should not be seen only as a riddle about missing trains and hidden vaults. It marked a hinge point in economic history. It demonstrated, in real time, how delicate national wealth becomes when it is concentrated in stores of value that can be stolen, diverted, or frozen. It also showed how quickly that wealth can be stripped away once a state loses the practical ability to defend its assets. And the story functions as a warning. Even though the events are now more than a century in the past, the underlying mechanics have not aged. Debt piled on top of weak economies, currencies deliberately manipulated, and the quiet transfer of power and wealth from the many to the very few. History does not literally repeat step for step, but it rhymes with disturbing accuracy. Rome diluted the metal content of its coins. The Russian Empire watched its gold disappear into the chaos of revolution and civil war. Modern governments authorize the creation of staggering amounts of new currency with a digital command. The tools differ: debased silver, vanished bullion, freshly issued money. But the end result is familiar. Ordinary people begin to lose faith in money. Elites find ways to shield themselves. Entire systems start to buckle under the weight of their own contradictions and lies. That is why, whenever you hear modern discussions about reserves, whether the subject is China increasing its gold holdings, the U.S. Federal Reserve creating more dollars, or sanctions freezing assets measured in the billions, the year 1917 should still be in view. The Russian Empire believed it was protected by the size of its hoard. Then, in the confusion of war and revolution, that hoard effectively vanished. With it went the financial stability of a great power. The pattern is simple. When the reserve disappears, the system that depends on it can collapse. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History already contains the answers, and I will show you where to look next.